Captain Emily Carter crouched low behind a ridge, her eyes scanning the dense forest stretching for miles below. The early morning mist clung to the pine tree like a ghostly veil, muffling the distant sounds of birds and streams. She could feel her heartbeat hammering in her chest, not from fear, but from anticipation. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready. Today's mission was straightforward in theory: infiltrate enemy territory, gather intelligence on their new communications hub, and extract without leaving a trace. But nothing in Emily's career had prepared her for what lay ahead. Her squad moved silently behind her, boots barely making a sound on the damp forest floor. Sergeant Marcus Kane, a seasoned soldier with a no-nonsense demeanor, whispered orders as he scanned the tree line for any movement. Private Ramirez, the youngest in the unit, fidgeted with his rifle, nervously checking the magazine. Emily offered a brief, reassuring nod. She had to appear calm, even if the pit of unease in her stomach churned like a storm. "This terrain favors the enemy," Emily whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "They know every nook, every ridge. We need to stay sharp." The squad descended into a narrow valley where fog clung to the ground in thick, rolling waves. Trees towered over them like silent sentinels, branches scraping against their helmets. Emily remembered her briefing. "Intel suggests enemy patrols are frequent here. Expect ambushes. Stay alert." She swallowed the lump in her throat. She had seen ambushes before, but never like this, never with stakes so high. One misstep could mean death, or worse, capture. As they reached a clearing, Emily signaled a halt. She pressed a gloved hand against the ground, listening for vibrations. The forest, silent moments ago, now hummed with a subtle tension, a snap of a branch, the faintest rustle of leaves. Her instincts screamed. "Enemy movement," she whispered. 2 o'clock, 40 meters out. Stay low." The squad flattened against the forest floor, rifles raised. Emily's eyes caught the glint of sunlight reflecting off a scope. A sniper? Possibly. Her pulse quickened. One wrong move and everything would be over. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the fragile calm. A hail of bullets tore through the clearing, sending dirt and leaves flying. Explosions shook the ground as an enemy squad emerged from the tree line, rifles blazing. The ambush was perfect, deadly. Emily's squad scattered instinctively, diving behind rocks, trees, anything that could shield them. "Return fire! Keep moving!" Emily shouted, firing with precision. Her training kicked in, each motion fluid, almost automatic. She could see Marcus pinned down behind a boulder, bullets splintering the rock inches from his head. She sprinted across the open space, dragging him to relative safety. Amid the chaos, Emily caught glimpses of her team being cut down or captured. Ramirez fired blindly at a shadow, then froze when a grenade landed nearby. Emily dove, grabbing him and rolling to cover as the explosion shredded the ground where they had just stood. The acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder filled her lungs. Every second stretched into eternity. She realized with a sickening clarity that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The enemy had them surrounded. Emily's mind raced. Escape is the only option. Survival is the mission now. She made a split-second decision and signaled the remaining squad members. Scatter, regroup if possible, but get out alive. Emily darted into the forest, branches whipping against her face and arms. Behind her, shouts, gunfire, and explosions painted a vivid picture of carnage. She could hear her squad's screams, Marcus, Ramirez, names that would haunt her if she didn't survive. Every instinct screamed, move, hide, survive. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. Emily navigated through the misty forest, avoiding patrols, crawling under fallen trees, and scaling steep ridges. She stumbled over roots, grazed her hands on jagged rocks, but never slowed. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth designed to crush hope. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at her, but she pressed on, each step a testament to her training and sheer willpower. By late afternoon, Emily reached a small clearing near a river. Her heart sank. Enemy patrols were methodical, sweeping the area systematically. She pressed herself into the brush, eyes scanning for escape routes. She couldn't risk crossing the open water with the enemy nearby, yet beyond that river lay a path leading to safety, a chance to regroup, a chance to live. She crouched, taking a moment to breathe. Her body ached, her uniform torn, and her hands were smeared with blood, hers from a scratch, theirs from saving comrades. She allowed herself a fleeting moments of grief. Her squad was gone, some captured, some dead. She whispered a vow under her breath. She would not be another statistic. She would survive. Night passed, and the forest transformed into a world of shadows and whispers. Emily's senses heightened. Every sound was amplified, every shadow a potential threat. She moved silently, guided by moonlight and the faint glimmer of stars. She found temporary refuge in a hollowed-out tree, pressing herself into the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of enemy patrols. Sleep was impossible, yet exhaustion threatened to overtake her. She forced herself to stay awake, imagining her family's faces, the people depending on her. By dawn, Emily had formulated a plan. She would use the river as a natural barrier to mislead the enemy, moving in short bursts under cover of darkness and fog. She checked her equipment, rifle loaded, map secured, compass at the ready. Every detail mattered. One slip could be fatal. Before moving, she took a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill her lungs. She was alone, surrounded by enemies, and in unfamiliar territory. But she was Emily Carter, a soldier trained to survive, a leader molded by adversity, and someone who refused to give up. With a final glance at the mist-covered valley, Emily slipped into the forest once more, invisible among the trees, a ghost in enemy territory. The impossible escape had begun. The forest seemed endless, a maze of shadows, whispers, and unseen dangers. Emily Carter pressed herself against a tree trunk, listening intently. Her breathing was shallow but controlled. Every sound, branch snapping, rustle of leaves, distant footsteps, set her nerves on edge. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting jagged streaks of light across the forest floor, but even daylight offered no safety here. Emily's mind raced as she calculated her next move. The river she had spotted the night before could be her lifeline. It would slow pursuit and mask her trail, but crossing it meant exposing herself in the open, and beyond it lay a valley she could navigate to higher ground, safety if she could survive the journey. She forced herself to focus, tuning out the fear that threatened to paralyze her. She moved slowly, every step deliberate. Her combat boots made no sound against mossy roots, her rifle raised and ready. She ducked low under hanging branches and crawled through thick underbrush when necessary. Her training kicked in fully. She became a shadow, invisible and precise, blending seamlessly with her surroundings. Hours passed. Emily scavenged what little supplies she could find: berries, small rodents, and clean water from shallow streams. Each meal was a calculated risk. The slightest sound could draw enemy attention. Her hands were cut and scraped from the harsh terrain, and her body ached from fatigue. Yet she pressed on. Every obstacle she overcame, every patrol she avoided, was a small victory, and small victories meant survival. By mid-afternoon, she heard the unmistakable sound of enemy patrols. Her pulse quickened, but Emily didn't panic. She pressed herself against the thick trunk of an ancient oak and surveyed her surroundings. The soldiers were methodical, moving in a pattern that could have been memorized by anyone familiar with military tactics. Emily noted their formation, counting numbers, noting where the heavier guns were. This information would be critical for her next move. She waited for them to pass, barely daring to breathe. When they disappeared down a winding path, she moved quickly, silently, her body low to the ground. The forest seemed alive with tension. Even the wind felt like a threat, carrying her scent, whispering her presence to unseen enemies. Night fell faster than she anticipated. The forest transformed, shadows deepening, sounds intensifying. She could hear distant gunfire from other skirmishes, the occasional shout of soldiers. She knew that staying in one place too long was just as dangerous as moving. Emily found a hollowed-out fallen tree, large enough to conceal her body, and crawled inside. Her rifle was at her side, her senses alert. She closed her eyes briefly, knowing sleep could be deadly, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her. As she rested, her mind wandered. Flashbacks of her squad, of Marcus laughing during training exercises, Ramirez nervously fumbling with equipment, and even the quiet moments before the ambush replayed vividly. She remembered the smiles, the camaraderie, the trust they had placed in her leadership. Guilt threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it aside. Regret could not save her now. Action could. Survival was her mission, and failure was not an option. She emerged from her hiding spot at first light, moving with renewed determination. She reached the riverbank, the water cold and fast-moving. It was a treacherous crossing, but Emily timed it with the rhythm of the enemy patrols. She waded cautiously, keeping her body low, rifle above her head. The current tugged at her legs, testing her strength, but she reached the far side unscathed. A small victory, but she knew it was only the beginning. The valley beyond was deceptively calm. Mist rose from the grass, and distant hills loomed like silent sentinels. Emily moved through it cautiously, scanning constantly for movement. Suddenly, she heard a faint snapping of a branch behind her. She froze, heart pounding, and spun toward the sound. A lone enemy soldier emerged from the fog, gun raised. Emily's reaction was instant. She rolled to the side, firing 2 precise shots that took him down silently. She pressed on, adrenaline surging, every nerve electrified. The encounter reminded her that danger lurked everywhere, that the enemy was relentless, and that she was alone in a hostile world. Hours later, she stumbled across an abandoned cabin, partially camouflaged by overgrowth. It offered shelter and a chance to rest, but she knew it could be a trap. She checked for signs of recent activity, footprints, cigarette butts, food scraps. Finding none, she entered cautiously. Inside, the cabin was empty but offered minimal protection from the elements. Emily used the opportunity to patch minor wounds and ration her limited supplies. Night fell again, and with it came new threats. Howls of wild animals echoed through the valley. The distant hum of vehicles reminded her that the enemy was still searching, methodical in their pursuit. Emily kept her rifle at the ready, every sense alert. She could not afford a single mistake. During the night, she discovered a small notebook left behind in the cabin. Inside were maps and notes, likely from locals or resistance fighters. Emily studied them carefully, piecing together a route through the forest that would give her the best chance to evade detection. Each line she traced on the paper brought a flicker of hope, a plan. By dawn, she was ready. She slipped silently from the cabin, following the mapped route through dense undergrowth, hidden valleys, and along the edges of ridges. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. She avoided open areas, used shadows and terrain to her advantage, and even created small diversions to mislead any patrolling enemies. Fatigue and hunger gnawed at her, but she pressed on. Every step brought her closer to safety and farther from the nightmare that had begun with the ambush. Her mind oscillated between fear and determination, but she refused to give in to despair. Then, in the late afternoon, Emily reached the edge of a ridge overlooking an enemy-controlled outpost. Soldiers moved like clockwork below, guarding the path she needed to take. She crouched behind a tree, assessing the situation. This was a critical moment. The outpost was heavily fortified, and any wrong move could cost her life. She needed to find a way past it to continue her impossible escape. Emily's training, instincts, and resourcefulness would be tested like never before. Every second here mattered. The enemy was vigilant, and her window of opportunity was shrinking. She clenched her fists, tightened her grip on her rifle, and took a deep breath. She had survived this far, she would survive further. Emily Carter crouched behind a cluster of rocks, overlooking the enemy outpost that sprawled across the valley below. Soldiers moved like clockwork, rifles slung, eyes scanning, radios crackling. She had studied their patrol patterns, counted the number of guards at each checkpoint, and memorized the weak spots in their perimeter. Yet, knowing the layout didn't make the danger any less real. One misstep, one careless breath, and she would become just another casualty in a war that had already claimed too many. Her body ached, her wounds throbbed, and exhaustion threatened to drag her down. But Emily forced herself to focus. Every detail mattered: the rotation of the guards, the timing of the searchlights, the gaps in their coverage. She whispered to herself, one step at a time, calm, precise, invisible. Crouching low, she began her approach. She hugged the shadow of the rocks, moving with the rhythm of the forest. Every snap of a twig under her boots felt deafening. Her heart pounded, but she controlled her breathing, slowing it to a steady rhythm that masked the adrenaline surging through her veins. The first checkpoint came into view, two soldiers pacing beneath a harsh floodlight. Emily froze behind a boulder, calculating the timing. As the soldiers turned away, she darted across a stretch of open ground, rolling into cover behind a stack of crates. Her hands shook slightly, but she didn't allow herself to falter. Minutes later, she encountered the perimeter fence, topped with barbed wire. Her eyes scanned for a weak spot. There, a section where the wire sagged slightly, hidden beneath a tangle of brush. Emily carefully cut a small hole using a multi-tool, keeping her body pressed flat to the ground. As she wriggled through, the scrape of fabric against metal made her wince, but she continued, forcing herself to ignore the pain. Beyond the fence lay the central compound. Guards moved with precision, some carrying flashlights, others monitoring radio communications. Emily ducked low, moving from shadow to shadow. Her every sense was heightened. The faintest sound, the slightest movement could betray her. She pressed against a wall, spotting a lone sentry slumping for a moment, distracted by a radio call. Timing was everything. Then she froze. From the corner of her eye, movement, a figure approaching from the opposite side. Emily's pulse surged. She pressed herself flat, holding her breath as the soldier passed within mere feet. Every second felt like an eternity. She couldn't afford hesitation. With a silent prayer, she darted toward the next cover point, rolling into a shadowed alcove behind a small shed. It was here that she spotted a lifeline, a narrow path leading toward the forest beyond, unguarded but exposed. She had no choice. Emily assessed her options. She could create a distraction, set off a small incendiary from her pack, draw attention away, and make a break for the path. The risk was high, but the alternative was being trapped in the compound. She moved quickly, placing the incendiary near a storage shed and ducking behind a stack of barrels. Within moments, flames erupted, sending smoke spiraling into the night sky. Guards shouted and fired toward the fire. Emily seized the moment, sprinting across the open ground, bullets whizzing past her. She rolled into a ditch, scrambling through thick mud, and vanished into the tree line. Her heart pounded in her ears, her body screaming with exertion, but she kept moving. Once in the forest, Emily slowed her pace, pressing herself against the shadows. She knew the danger wasn't over. Enemy patrols would soon be combing the perimeter. Every instinct screamed caution, but she also knew she couldn't afford to stop. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by distant shouts and barking dogs. Emily navigated by memory, using the landmarks she had noted during her initial scouting. Suddenly, movement in the underbrush caught her attention. A figure emerged, a local civilian, ragged and wary, eyes wide with fear. Emily raised a hand slowly, signaling she meant no harm. The civilian hesitated, then nodded, understanding the danger surrounding them both. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "Follow me. I know a safe path through the hills." The civilian, a young man, fell into step beside her. They moved cautiously, silently communicating with hand gestures. The forest was dense, the ground uneven, and every step brought new dangers, hidden traps, enemy snipers, and sudden drops in terrain. Emily guided the civilian, her mind constantly calculating the safest path, while also remaining aware that he might be a liability, or worse, a trap. But she had no choice. The shared burden of survival became a necessity. Night fell again, and Emily made a decision. They would rest briefly in a shallow cave she had spotted earlier. She barricaded the entrance with rocks and brush, scanning the perimeter for threats. The civilian whispered a soft thanks, and Emily allowed herself a small measure of relief. For a few moments she could rest, patching minor wounds and eating a meager ration. But the respite was short-lived. In the distance, the faint hum of helicopters pierced the night sky. Searchlights swept over the forest canopy, cutting through darkness like blades. Emily's chest tightened. Enemy reinforcements were close. She motioned for the civilian to follow, moving deeper into the forest, taking less obvious paths, sticking to shadows. They navigated a narrow ravine, the sides steep and slick with mud. Emily's strength was waning, but she refused to falter. Every step was agony. Her muscles screamed, her wounds throbbed, yet exhaustion kept her moving. She could feel the enemy closing in, the sound of shouting, barking dogs, and gunfire growing nearer. At the edge of a thicket, Emily paused. She surveyed the area below. A small clearing led toward a river that, if crossed, would take her out of immediate danger. But the clearing was exposed, and enemy patrols would notice any movement. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final push. "On my signal," she whispered to the civilian. "Run fast, don't look back." The moment arrived. Emily darted forward, dragging the civilian behind her. Bullets tore through the trees around them, and the enemy shouted, trying to cut them off. They sprinted through mud and underbrush, hearts hammering, lungs burning. Emily reached the river first, diving into the cold, rushing water. She kicked, swam, and pulled the civilian along, keeping them both low to avoid detection. On the far bank, they collapsed briefly, gasping for air, bodies trembling from exertion and cold. Emily looked back at the enemy outpost, smoke rising from the fire she had set earlier. For a moment, relief washed over her. The impossible escape was unfolding successfully, but dangers still lurked. She pulled herself up, determination burning brighter than exhaustion. "We're not safe yet," she whispered. "Keep moving." With every ounce of strength left, Emily led the civilian through the forest, following hidden trails, ducking under branches, and navigating rocky terrain. Every rustle, every shadow kept them on edge, but Emily's sharp eyes and steady mind guided them forward. Her training, instincts, and sheer willpower carried them farther away from the enemy. The first rays of dawn filtered through the treetops, casting long shadows over the rugged valley below. Emily Carter crouched behind a rock outcropping, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold. The forest around her was eerily quiet, broken only by the faint hum of distant helicopters. She glanced at the civilian beside her, wide-eyed, terrified, but alive. Together they had survived the impossible. Yet Emily knew the danger was far from over. The enemy was relentless, and every second counted. She studied the valley ahead. Beyond it lay the final stretch of forest that could bring them to relative safety, U.S.-controlled territory, friendly forces, and the hope of rescue. But between them and freedom, enemy patrols crisscrossed the terrain, alert and ready to strike. Emily pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her pulse thudding in rhythm with the adrenaline still surging through her body. Every step would be a battle. Every sound could be their last. "Stay low," she whispered to the civilian, who nodded silently, clutching the small knife Emily had given him for protection. Emily scanned the area. A ridge offered some cover, but it would require them to move quickly across an exposed clearing to reach it. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Now," she whispered, and they dashed. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, tearing through the brush. Emily rolled into the shallow ditch at the far edge of the clearing, pulling the civilian with her. The enemy shouted, rifles blazing, but Emily had timed it perfectly. She pressed on, weaving through trees and fallen logs, every step a delicate balance of speed and stealth. The forest opened to a narrow ravine, a natural barrier that slowed their pursuers. Emily used the terrain to her advantage, picking a steep path along the rocky side. Her muscles screamed, wounds throbbed, but she refused to stop. Every step brought them closer to safety. Every step reminded her of the lives lost, the squad captured, and the mission that had started it all. She gritted her teeth, using pain as fuel, pushing herself forward. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of enemy pursuit broke the tension, the clatter of boots on rock, shouts, and barking dogs. Emily froze for a split second, calculating the odds. Ahead, the ravine opened to a dense thicket which could conceal them from the advancing patrols. She motioned for the civilian to follow, and they slipped into the shadows, barely daring to breathe. Hours passed in tense silence. Emily moved like a shadow, her senses on high alert. Hunger gnawed at her, and exhaustion threatened to overtake her, but she kept her mind focused. She thought of her family, of her squad, of the oath she had sworn to protect and survive. The forest tested every fiber of her being, yet she refused to falter. Then, in the distance, she saw the glimmer of hope, faint lights flickering like stars through the trees. Her heart surged. U.S. forces were near. Emily's pulse quickened, and a surge of renewed energy carried her forward. She motioned to the civilian to keep low and follow closely. Almost there, just a little further. As they approached the clearing, the sound of helicopters grew louder. 2 aircraft hovered above, searchlights sweeping the forest floor. Emily knew they needed to reach an extraction point before enemy reinforcements intercepted them. She scanned the area and spotted a makeshift landing zone, a narrow patch cleared of trees and debris, just enough for a small chopper to touch down. She sprinted toward it, dragging the civilian with her. Bullets began to whistle through the trees, some narrowly missing her as enemy snipers tried to cut them off. Emily fired back with precision, her training keeping her steady despite exhaustion. Every step was agony, but survival demanded it. Finally, they reached the extraction zone. A team of U.S. soldiers covered the area, suppressing enemy fire with controlled bursts from their rifles. Emily collapsed against the nearest soldier, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. She quickly signaled for the civilian, helping him onto the chopper. The rotors whipped the forest into a frenzy of dust, leaves, and noise, but Emily didn't hesitate. She climbed aboard, grateful to feel solid ground beneath her feet once again. As the aircraft lifted off, Emily peered over the forest below. Smoke rose from the fires she had set, marking the chaos she had endured and survived. The enemy outpost shrank beneath her, the valley fading as the aircraft carried them to safety. Relief washed over her, mingled with exhaustion and grief. The mission had cost so much, yet she had survived against impossible odds. Inside the helicopter, Emily slumped into a seat, letting herself breathe for the first time in days. Her hands were bruised and bloodied, her uniform torn, and her body ached from fatigue. But the familiar hum of U.S. military radio chatter, the sight of armed soldiers ready to protect, reminded her she was finally safe. Her mind wandered to the squad she had left behind. Marcus, Ramirez, and the others, some captured, some lost, would weigh heavily on her thoughts. She had survived, but the cost of war was never far from memory. Emily stared out the window at the fading forest, letting herself reflect. The mission had tested every ounce of her skill, intelligence, and courage. She had faced impossible odds, and she had prevailed. As the helicopter approached a secure base, Emily prepared to step onto solid ground. Medics were waiting, ready to tend to her wounds, while commanding officers would debrief her on every detail of her harrowing escape. She allowed herself a small smile. She had survived. She had led. She had fought with every ounce of her being, and she would carry the lessons of this mission, courage, resilience, and determination, forever. On the ground, Emily was met with congratulations, gratitude, and relief from her comrades. She gave brief acknowledgments, her focus already shifting to recovery and next steps. But inside, she carried the weight of the experience, the fear, the solitude, the relentless drive to survive. She had been alone, surrounded by enemies, and yet she had made it out alive. Standing on solid ground, Emily looked back at the forest that had tried to claim her. The mist still hung over the treetops, the distant smoke rising from burned-out outposts, a reminder of the chaos she had navigated. She felt a sense of triumph, tempered by the gravity of the mission. She had done what few could, survived what many could not, and proven the depth of her resilience. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the base and the world beyond, Emily allowed herself one final deep breath. She had escaped the impossible. She had survived against all odds, and she was ready to face whatever came next, stronger, wiser, and unbreakable.